Thanks to Shopify for supporting Future Hindsight. Shopify is a platform designed for anyone to sell anywhere, giving entrepreneurs like myself the resources once reserved for big business. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/hopeful, all lowercase. Welcome to Future Hindsight, a podcast on a mission to spark civic action. I'm your host, Mila Atmos. I'm a global citizen based in New York City, and I'm deeply curious about the way our society works. So each week, I bring you conversations to cut through the confusion around today's most important civic issues and share clear, actionable ways for us to build a brighter future together. After all, democracy is not a spectator sport. Tomorrow starts right now. Since I live in New York City, I'm familiar with the Working Families Party and fusion voting. And while I strongly support the existence of third parties, I've been skeptical about the viability of such parties in the American system, which is structured in a way that enables two powerful parties to be dominant. But in the wake of the Democratic Party's defeat in the presidential election, perhaps now is a time for a third party to really take center stage. Our guest is Maurice Mitchell, the National Director of the Working Families Party. He's a nationally recognized social movement strategist, a visionary leader in the movement for Black lives, and a community organizer for racial, social, and economic justice. Welcome, Maurice. Thank you for joining us.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
You're welcome. Let's start with the basics.
Yeah.
What is the Working Families Party?
Okay. Well, the Working Families Party is a grassroots, bottom-up, third-party project inside the United States. And I know your listeners are thinking, well, in the United States, this is a rigid two-party system. So what's the big idea with this idea of a third party? What does that look like? And I like to say that we're a non-delusional third party. So we don't pretend that we don't live in a very rigid two-party system, that we don't have a first past the post electoral system, which means whoever gets the most votes gets the entire prize. We're clear about that. And we actually believe that that type of system is fundamentally undemocratic and leads to really, really poor outcomes. And if we don't express ourselves outside of that system, that it will lead to the conditions that we're in right now. And so our strategy is based on this idea that you can build third parties from the ground up. We don't believe in the top-down model, kind of like the Ross Perot model, where in 1992, Ross Perot, he was a billionaire, so he basically had unlimited money.
Right.
But
he did get 19% of the vote at that time,
yeah.
Which is actually a lot.
It's a lot. He didn't break 20%.
Right.
And to me, that was the best test case for a third party in this system.
Right.
We looked at that and we're like, well, we're not billionaires. We're
Right,
labor
you can't do that.
unions. We're grassroots organizations. Like, if a billionaire couldn't make it be viable with all of that money and all of those resources, then how can we actually make a third-party experiment work in the United States? And so we started in 1998. Mm-hmm. We're in New York right now.
Yes.
So we started in New York as a coalition of labor unions and grassroots organizations. And ironically, we came together because many people felt that the Democratic Party was losing its commitment to everyday working people. Mm-hmm. This is 1998. Because of some of the policies that the Democratic Party was committing to, the economic policies, the sort of neoliberal...
So in the wake of NAFTA.
Yeah, free trade policies. Now, fast forward 26 years, we're living in a world where a lot of the people who lost their jobs because of NAFTA, because of the offshoring of those jobs, a lot of those communities eventually turned to the right wing, right? And so we believe that our idea in 98 was very prescient. Now, since then, we've heard so many people say, we want to live in a world where there are more options from the bottom all the way to the top. And that in a country of more than 300 million people, where you have almost unlimited choices of butter or yogurt, we should have more than two choices for president, right? We're hearing that more and more. This was a presidential election where we had probably more popular conversations around third parties than ever before, where people were saying, we want something else. And the problem is, because the system is so rigid, when third parties try to run in a general election, and this is a systemic flaw, it leads to the spoiler dilemma.
Yes.
Where, okay, if you're a left party, let's say you're a left of the Democrats,
Yes.
you're likely to pull some necessary votes away from the Democrat, one of the main party candidates, towards your party, which will only advantage the Republican Party, the party that you have less in common with.
Right. Notably during the 2000 election.
Yes, right? And so this is a real problem,
Yes.
right? And it's a systemic problem in our democracy. The way the Working Families Party solves for that is we cook with what we have in the kitchen. We understand that this system is not, for lack of a better word, it's not ideal,
Yes.
right? And so we do a few things.
Right.
In states like New York and Connecticut and Oregon, there is something called fusion voting.
Yes.
Maybe I'll get into it more later, but it basically means that parties have their own ballot line. Parties like the Working Families Party have their own ballot line. So when you vote in New York, like you're a New York voter, you could vote on the Democratic Party line, the Republican Party line, or the Working Families Party line. What makes fusion interesting is that parties can cross-endorse the candidates of other parties. And this is how we get over the spoiler problem, where we could organize people into our party, and we could organize people around a set of values and issues, for example, education, healthcare, a critique on U.S. foreign policy. And those voters could come together and they understand that a vote on the Working Families Party line signals that they're voting for these issues, for the interest of these labor unions and grassroots organizations, right? And at the same time, we could say at the top of the ticket, it still is a binary choice based on this system. And so we're informing our voters that in this binary choice, we should choose, for example, this last election, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. And all those votes on the Working Families Party line in New York and Connecticut ultimately get fused with the votes on the Democratic Party line. So you don't waste your vote.
Right.
But you get to...
So I have a question
Yeah.
about, you said that your policies are different.
Yeah.
Maybe not every single one from the Democratic Party, let's say.
Yeah.
But how does that get funneled up to the actual candidate? Like, how many votes, in this last election, 24, how many votes did the Working Families Party get? And how did you communicate the power of your voice to the candidate?
Great question. So just in New York, we got more than 250,000 votes, right? It's a significant number of votes in one state.
Right.
I mean, we are in an election that was decided by less than 200,000 votes around the country in swing states. So we're just talking about more than 250,000 people chose to vote on the Working Families Party line just in New York. And why that's significant, I want to explain it from the top all the way to the bottom, right? So elections tend to be close, especially in this period, right? I've seen elections that we've won by a handful of votes, or we've lost by like less than 100 votes, right?
Yes.
So in New York, in the Hudson Valley, there were a number of very, very close elections, congressional elections. Congressman Riley, for example, he won his election by a fraction. That margin could be made up by the voters in the Working Families Party line. And who controls the House of Representatives is hugely important, right? And right now, it's one of the closest houses. The Republicans won, but it's one of the closest sort of margins.
Right.
That flip from Republican to Democrat was in part brought to you by the Working Families Party and our voters because of how close the margins are. And people might be thinking, well, those Working Families Party voters, wouldn't they just have been Democratic Party voters if you didn't have the ballot line? Well, some of them.
Yes.
And some of them, for sure, a significant number of them would have been part of the many, many, many millions of people who every single election believe many of the things that we believe but stay home.
Yes.
And need a positive reason to vote and to organize their vote around something that they believe in.
Yeah.
And that's what the Working Families Party has done again and again and again. So that's the impact
Yes.
and how that translates. So if that's the impact on the congressional level,
Yeah.
and I guarantee you, because I get the phone calls,
Yes.
our leaders and our members in states get the phone calls from elected officials that after the election, they could do the math,
Right.
It's very clear. They want to understand how to stay in the good graces of the Working Families Party.
Yeah.
And we are able to surface these issues. In
Well,
New York,
I have a question about that because I'm curious about your theory of change at the Working Families Party.
Yeah.
And you have a deep background in organizing, and you're talking about the power of electoral politics in affecting change at the government level.
Yeah.
So what's really the power in that? Electing somebody on the Working Families Party ticket or throwing your vote in that direction in order to tip the election.
Yeah.
And so what's the power of that over or maybe in addition to issue advocacy?
Absolutely. Well, elections are not the prize. Governing is the prize. And so there's vehicles. Their main existence is to raise and spend really smart political money in order to get people elected. You know, ever since the Citizens United ruling, it's allowed for unlimited spending on the independent side. So you have these independent vehicles that technically don't coordinate with the candidate, that raise and spend political money simply to get people elected. And there's many really efficient organizations that do that work on the Democratic Party side, on the Republican Party side. That's not who we are. We're not just about getting people elected. We're about actually governing, which brings in the question of policy, which means we have a relationship with our endorsed elected officials and our endorsed candidates before the election. And when I say we, it's not just a bunch of smart staff people. I'm talking about our party apparatus, which includes labor unions and their members, grassroots organizations and their members, party activists who show up before the election and volunteer and participate and, you know, bring their sweat equity and their small dollar donations and everything else into the fight so that candidate knows who actually propelled them to victory. And then post-election, we govern with them. And I want to give an example. So I talked on the congressional level. Let's stay in New York.
Yes.
And let's go down to the city council because
you had some big victories there.
Oh, absolutely. And I want to pull out a specific example of what I mean by we govern together as a party. Cheyose. Cheyose is a independent Working Families Party city council member. And Che is one of the youngest city council members, a millennial city council member. Che, with his colleagues in the city council, but Che led this, and, you know, with the forces of the Working Families Party, both on the city council and many of the grassroots organizations that make up our party, passed legislation where New York renters were faced with this really problematic practice where whether or not you went through a broker, if you rented in New York, you had to pay a broker's fee.
Right, as a renter.
As a renter.
As opposed to the owner who's renting it out.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's just unfair, right?
Yes, totally.
And it's an unfair practice. It only served the industry. It didn't serve everyday New Yorkers. But it remained because it's a very powerful industry. It's a very powerful lobby.
Yes.
And because of Che's independence as an independent WFP elected official, and with the support of the WFP coalition, was able to loudly and proudly pass that pro-everyday worker, everyday renter legislation, right? So that shows the direct line between the Working Families Party, our grassroots power, our ability to elect independent elected officials, and then govern with them and deliver on policies that support the members of labor unions and grassroots organizations and everyday working people across the city that are suffering from this affordability crisis.
Yeah.
Right. So that's a concrete example of how that works. And we do that across the country, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. And there's a number of different examples, including places where we don't have fusion voting. So we just kind of focused on the state of New York. We went to the top of the ticket.
Yeah.
We talked about how our ballot line has an impact in congressional races, actually swinging congressional races, which is like a big deal.
It's a big deal.
But then also on the local level, governing with and by everyday working people.
Extrapolate this onto the national stage. Because right now you're in 15 states.
Yeah.
And we have 50 states.
Yes, that's
correct.
correct.
So what's the strategy? How do we get there?
Okay, sure. So, this country is very large. It's the size of a continent. There is more than 300 million people in this country, and we're broken up into 50 states. And it's actually really important that your listeners are reminded of this. We learned this in civics class, but power is very diffuse in this country.
Yes.
And we did our hardest to defeat Donald Trump. although we failed and Trump and MAGA now will eventually run the federal government, presidents in this country are not kings. And despite all the efforts of the recent Supreme Court, the presidents are still not kings, which means a lot of power exists on the state level, on the county level, on the local level, which is why the Working Families Party focuses so much on building from the ground up, state by state by state. And we do have aspirations to be everywhere and to have party structures everywhere. But in order for this model to work, it takes a little bit of time. That's the thing that we like to sort of remind people. There's no microwave revolution, right? The real organizing takes some time.
Yes.
I think our friends on the far right, they understood that in the mid to late 70s.
It has taken them decades.
Decades and decades
and
and
they
decades.
were dedicated to this project.
Absolutely. And so the work that we're doing at the Working Families Party is a generational project where we believe in the next 20 years, we could have a third force in American politics and a true independent labor party called the Working Families Party, organizing that third force. So like you said, we currently have party structures in 15 states. So just like New York, grassroots organizations, labor institutions, activists are endorsed candidates who then govern with us. And every cycle, that grows. So I'll give an example. In California, which is a new state, a relatively new state, we've been cooking with grease. And so at the end of this election, we now have 100 Working Families Party endorsed elected officials up and down the ballot in California. So that includes people in school boards. That includes people on the county level, on the municipal level. That includes people on the state legislator level. And even Latifah Simon, who's going to be a new Working Families Party congressional leader, which we're very proud of. And what we understand is that this country, this is something that your listeners should take note of. We're looking at long-term trends. So population is moving to the south. And if the population moves to the south, that means electoral college votes are moving to the southeast and the southwest. So there's a world.
Yeah, thanks for that reminder.
Yeah.
Because every time you have a census, you rejigger the electoral college.
That's correct. So there's a world in the future where the Democrats may reestablish the quote-unquote blue wall of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania.
But to no avail because they will be less powerful.
Yeah. And so the Working Families Party is organizing in the South. We have chapters in Texas, in Georgia. In Georgia, we have an organizing committee. In Arizona, we have an organizing committee. And we're also in New Mexico, and we're developing a long-term strategy to build that type of power in the South. Now, we don't have the ballot line, even though just recently in Kansas and New Jersey, there are lawsuits arguing that fusion should be law in those states.
Yes.
And there's been a growing movement for fusion voting throughout the country. And it's not just the Working Families Party. There are political moderates and people who are on the center-right who are arguing for fusion. Because imagine a world where in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania and Arizona and Georgia, all of these swing states, there was fusion voting. You could imagine many of the conflicted voters who knew they weren't Republicans but were struggling around the choice, they would have had a ballot line and they would have had something to vote for. Many of the voters that were struggling around the Democrats' position in Gaza would have had an option that was actually anti-war.
Yeah.
That said, we are anti-war. We're going to organize our votes to be the anti-war faction that is also pro-democracy.
Right.
So vote on our line. Many of the voters who don't identify as Democrats because maybe they've identified all their lives as being maybe Republican, being something else, being independent, whatever, they could say, all right, I could vote for Kamala Harris on a line that isn't identified with the Democratic Party, right? So you could imagine in a world where there was fusion voting, we might have been in a different situation and a different outcome. We think that it's pretty clear.
We'll be back with Maurice Mitchell in just a moment, so stick around. You definitely don't want to miss this episode's Civic Spark, one small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. But first, we want to tell you about our sponsor, Shopify. Take a minute to think about businesses that are putting up numbers. What comes to mind? Maybe someone like Mattel or Heinz? Classic brands, right? And I'm sure you're thinking about a cool brand with brilliant marketing and, of course, a great product. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling and for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And I have a not-so-secret secret for you. A little something called ShopPay, the payment method that boosts conversions up to 50%. That means way fewer carts going abandoned and way more sales going cha-ching. So, if you're into growing your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling. On the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Shopify gives you everything you need to take control and take your business to the next level, no matter how big you want to grow. And that's what I love about Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout Heinz uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/hopeful, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/hopeful to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/hopeful. And now, let's return to my conversation with Maurice Mitchell. You're saying something really interesting here about policies driving people to the voting booth, right? But we're in a really cynical time, I think, about political parties and about the political process. And in a time when it doesn't feel that government is delivering, even though it may in fact be doing that, whether it's actually doing that or not, the feeling is that it's not. Do deliverables really matter? Does the policy prescription really matter? Because Kamala Harris, for example, talked about, $25,000 for your first home or something like this. And I thought to myself, okay, well, that got no traction at all.
Okay. All right. This is a really great question. Does policy matter? Does delivering matter? It's not a simple question. From the standpoint of the ethical and moral responsibility to use our power and to leverage the power that we have, and if that's governing power, for the greater good, and to use government as a tool to, in some ways, redistribute compassion. Yes, it does matter, right?
Right.
Whatever the political ramifications, it matters on that level. But let's go a little bit deeper. Government, organizations, they're all human systems, right? At the end of the day, we're people. And people operate from the standpoint of how they feel, right? Like, that's how I operate. That's how you operate.
Right.
How you feel.
That's how humans are.
Right?
Yeah.
And so if facts contradict your feelings is the information or the inputs that you're going to privilege, right? And so if we're ever in a situation where we're arguing against people's feelings, we're in the wrong conversation as people who are concerned with politics, 'cause politics are essentially about people. So that's number one. Number two, this is deep in our evolutionary biology. People really learn through stories. People understand their place in the world through stories. People contextualize through stories. If you're not telling a compelling story, or if there is a more compelling story, that story will be how people understand the world and understand what you're doing, what everybody else is doing. Stories have heroes. Stories have villains. And I think there's a lot we can learn from this past election. I think Donald Trump, and I want to be clear, I never mentioned the truth. Right?
Well, the truth is, how can I say, we are very committed to speak truthfully only on this podcast.
Yes.
But I feel like the truth has no value in many ways.
Well, I think the truth has value. I think we should be real about what is the nature of the purpose or the value of the truth in politics, right?
Yes, let's go there.
You don't need to be truthful in politics. You don't need to be ethical in politics. You need to tell the most compelling story.
Yes.
But having a compelling story that is supported by the truth and is supported by ethics is certainly, to me, a much more durable story, right, from a political standpoint, but also ethically what I choose to do and how I choose to live my life and why I believe the nature of the politics I'm involved in isn't simply a marketing device, but is actually a concern with something much deeper. But politics don't need to have fidelity to the truth. And so when I see breathless liberals clutching their pearls and pointing out Donald Trump's lies and pointing out the fact that he's choosing to engage politics in this manner, it's like, this is a form of politics. This right-wing authoritarian form of politics is about chaos, is about gaslighting the society, and it's about scrambling the truth. That's actually what the politics are for. That's the nature of the politics, and so we shouldn't be surprised. And Donald Trump is going to do what he's going to do. MAGA's going to do what they're going to do. What are we going to do?
Yes,
and so
what are we going to do?
Yeah,
and what do we stand for?
So the question is, what is our compelling story?
Yes.
And in this last election, yes, you're right. VP Harris had articulated a number of very popular policies. I guarantee you she wasn't naming those policies because they were unpopular. They were popular, and we know they're popular because you could poll them and you could see that they're popular. In fact, when you remove those policies from any elected official or candidate or party, they do very well with independents, with people. Like, they're popular.
Yes.
The thing that I think people should be curious about is, like, what are the stories that we're telling people?
Yeah.
Who are the heroes? Who are the villains? In each one of those stories, each one of those policies, rather, there are, to me, clear heroes and villains. So the fact that there are specific hedge funds that are buying up single-family homes, artificially driving up the value of those homes, leading to exploding rents and exploding home prices. The fact that there are companies that are using algorithms and AI to artificially explode the prices of rents. These are nameless, faceless algorithms, but organized by organizations and entities and hedge funds and rapacious capitalists that have names and faces. They should have been called out.
100%. But they wouldn't do that. Democrats wouldn't do that.
Correct.
And I feel like this is the right place to ask about neoliberalism and how it has changed not only our societies, meaning the way that we live every day, but also the way that the political process has been warped, let's say. It's a mild understatement. But, and how basically, I would say neither the Republican Party nor the Democratic Party has really been representing people full stop. They've just been representing corporate interests.
Yeah.
And so in that light, I feel like the vote for Trump was really because he's a chaos agent. And I think people know that. I don't think this is foreign to people.
No.
People understand he's a chaos agent because they want systems change. And they want something that's going to break the system no matter what the cost is to themselves. Because they think no matter what, they themselves will not be affected. That's just somebody else is going to be affected by the breaking down of the system.
Correct.
And I think there's also no real grasp of what breaking the system will actually do for all of us. And I mean that I don't really know either because I don't know what's going to break, which one he's going to successfully break, I
don't think anybody knows, including Trump and MAGA, what will actually happen.
Right.
And if we take a few steps back, all of us around the world have been operating inside of this political and economic and social philosophy of neoliberalism for more than 40 years. And it was supposed to be this magic, almost like utopian philosophy where the end of big ideas, we figured it out. It's the end of history, right? We figured out this model that is going to create unlimited growth and trickle that growth down to everybody, trickle the wealth down to everyone. And it's based on all of these ideas that we don't even think about, but are part and parcel of how we operate. And these philosophies that we don't really think about very often, but we live in. This idea that everything has a value in the market and that the market is almost magically attuned to solve every problem. And it's like a religious faith in the market. The idea that corporations have one duty alone, to serve their shareholders. This shareholder supremacy. And the idea that the shareholders are the only stakeholder.
Yes. And I want to add here that during the Reagan administration, stock buybacks became legal again.
Yes.
And they had been illegal. And I think people also don't remember that.
Yes. I mean, there are real policies, right? So there are real policies that followed this philosophy.
Yes.
The idea that there is no society, actually. There's just individuals, there's people, maybe families, and that's it.
Right.
Which is a very interesting and radical idea, but it has an impact on how we live our lives. So, okay, there's just individuals. There is no society that you have to take care
of. As Margaret Thatcher famously said and Ronald Reagan embraced.
Right. That the markets are somehow magically designed to solve all our problems. So if we have big problems, little problems, the best solution is to figure out how to create the market-based solution, and that somehow the competition inside the market will create the more efficient problem. That somehow efficiency is the goal. Efficiency in itself is the goal, and greed is good, right? Yeah. And many, many other tenets that now we live in. So, for example, with education, the goal of education isn't to develop and sharpen your mind or to develop curiosity, or the goal of education has to be economized. And so also the way that we even determine what a good education is, it's all based on high stakes testing.
Right.
There's a metric attached to it. There's obsession with metrics.
Right.
And then for many people who are going into higher education, they decide what a good route is based on what major will lead to the most money post-election. Right?
Yeah.
So all these, we don't even question it, but like this is neoliberalism in action. Yeah. And what it has done is it's led to people feeling totally disconnected because there was a bigger commons. By commons, I mean all the things that we, through government, invest in together.
Right.
Like parks and libraries and, and we shrunk the commons in service of the market, right? So, all right, well, we're in New York right now. Not too long ago, a generation ago, people actually went to free or close to free college in New York.
Yes.
Right?
This is, again, before Reagan.
Yes, right.
Just to make sure we remember this history.
Right. But and we just included it as part of the commons.
Right.
But this neoliberal consensus suggested that, well, no.
Not everybody deserves.
Yes.
Some people deserve and some people don't. And it depends on the efficiency and what the market can deliver.
Yes.
But let's talk about reclaiming the commons, right? Like I'm also passionate about reclaiming the commons. That's one reason I do this podcast. But how can party politics get us there? How do you get to reclaiming the commons? Through the Working Families Party.
Absolutely. So I believe that one of the reasons why we have the outcomes that we have is that people are disconnected, people are lonely, people are afraid. And that's one of the horrible hangovers of neoliberalism. It's done its job of having people feel like there is no society. And it turns out when you are disconnected, you lose a sense of purpose, you lose a grasp of meaning. And so we need to reverse that. The way that you do that is through association, it's through connection, it's through belonging. And one of the ways that happens, and one of the ways that you reclaim democracy is through a robust civil society, which basically means organization. And one of the things that we know around the world, and it's true in this country, when you have weak organization, weak trade unions, weak civic organizations, a weak sense of connection, it's very easy for the uber wealthy and oligarchs and authoritarians to take over. And that's something that is happening in this country that we can reverse through coming together as parties. It's one of the reasons why I focus so much on party organizing. It's unfortunate, but the party system in this country does not allow people to feel that sense of connection. It's become one marketing scheme versus another.
Right.
So, famously...
Although it didn't used to be this way.
No,
I was just reading about Tammany Hall and how it was like real, it was a real patronage. The party boss bailed you out of jail, made sure you didn't get that ticket.
Totally.
And there was a direct connection, which we no longer have. Now it's like, give me $10 and elect me to Congress or whatever,
Most people's experience of their party is a text from them.
Yes.
A breathless text about why today...
Why you need to give today another $5 or whatever.
And it's funny, some people might remember Tammany Hall because they might have learned it in high school civics, perhaps, right? And there's downsides to patronage.
Right.
And there's upsides to that type of party relationship. It's funny, when we talk about a lot of these previous eras of the Democratic Party and other parties, we kind of poo-poo and look down on some of that, and because there was some serious corruption,
Of
for
course.
sure.
Yes.
And people had a real applied, deep relationship to their party.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And I believe we need to return to a commitment to a deep, connected relationship to their party. I remember I was in Barcelona, and I was blown away by the fact that, this is a parliamentary system, right? So there's a lot more parties.
Yes.
But there were bars, right, that people went and they socialized in.
Right.
That were attached to particular political
Right.
parties.
There were party
right?
bars.
Yes. And so we need to think very seriously after an election where I was knocking on doors and I met people in places like North Philly who were like, you're the first person I spoke to. This is like days before the election. And I agree with everything you're saying. Like what you're saying sounds nice. Like nobody was disagreeing with any of the issues, but they're just like, I don't believe that lady, they're talking about VP Harris, is gonna, if we vote for her, that it's gonna matter.
Right.
They weren't right-wingers. They weren't Trumpists. They weren't.
Just looking at what's happening in Gaza.
Yeah.
Why would anybody believe that our vote matters? And that's so concrete in this moment.
Yes.
Because a majority of Americans want to stop sending arms and stop the war.
Yes.
And stop the genocide, if you are willing to call it that.
Yes.
And it's that kind of thing where like, well, it's not going to matter. And it doesn't really matter which one you're going to vote for, if you're going to vote. Because the policy on that, which is a horrendous policy and for which we pay with our dear tax dollars, is not going to change.
Yes. And what happens, and so this is, because a lot of people are focusing on the working class people that may have voted for Trump.
Yeah.
And I think we should be curious about what's going on there.
Yeah.
I have some ideas.
Right. But a lot of people just stayed home.
Yeah. There are a lot of people who, if they had pulled the lever, they would have pulled the lever for democracy. They stayed home because this system, now it is to me the byproduct of more than 40 years of neoliberalism, right? This huge transfer of wealth from everyday people all the way to the top, this hollowing out of our economy, this hollowing out of the commons, this disconnection of everyday people. So people are just kind of swimming around in a sea without feeling connected to anything, with no purchase of meaning. We should not be surprised that people are cynical or skeptical as it relates to how politics might actually redound to anything meaningful in their lives.
Yes.
That, to me, is a much deeper issue, the issue of a growing cynicism on people's belief that anything matters at all. And it's not like people are making this up.
Right.
And that's
it's
one.
Real.
It's real.
Not just a feeling, in fact.
It's not just a feeling. It's a feeling, and it's a feeling attached to people's real experience.
Yeah.
Same thing with the economy, right? So I think this is something that really mystified, especially a lot of Democrats, because we were definitely part of the community of people that were arguing. And we were able to win this argument that the Democratic Party and the Biden administration should really challenge the neoliberal consensus and the trickle-down consensus and invest in a robust industrial policy and stimulate the economy by investing in everyday people, by creating great union jobs, by all those things happened. And the impact of that is probably going to be felt much later. So Trump is probably going to...
10 years.
Trump will take advantage of it. And month after month after month, we saw positive job growth. So when you look at these macroeconomic indicators, the quote-unquote economy is doing well.
Yeah.
There was an increase...
But your rent went up and didn't go back down.
Yes, your rent went up and didn't go back down. Inflation happened, so the price of basic goods went up. And even though there was a bump in inflation and then eventually the rate of inflation petered down, the rate of inflation petered down, those prices didn't go back down. Right. And because so much of the wealth, like you look at the S&P, right? You look at the stock market.
Which is totally dislodged from the actual performance on the ground.
Yes.
Because you're buying your own stock back and driving up the stock prices.
Yeah. And so, yes, absolutely. That indicator is real, that all of that wealth is bouncing around, but it's not hitting everyday people's pockets, right?
Yeah.
And so the people that I'm talking to in actual communities, they're not making this up. It's real. And so the way that we have to respond to it, it's ironic. So many right-wingers get this right, especially the right-wing populists, where they simply say, because they don't have, they're not curious about actual solutions, but they're like, yeah, believe your eyes and ears.
Right.
The suffering that you feel is real.
Yeah.
It's valid. You're valid. You're important. Your suffering is important. Your feelings are important.
I think that's true.
And if you have the sneaky suspicion that there's a set of elites that have rigged the system to their advantage, you're right.
Yes, this is true.
You're right. And work with me.
Right.
Work with me so that I could, with you, help you protect your family, help you regain your dignity, right? And this is how we're going to do it. We're going to come together. We're going to regain our national dignity, our personal dignity, our ability to protect our families, and we're going to fight back against the elites and the establishment who have robbed from you and given to them. And the them is whichever other makes sense.
Right.
You know, for us, it might be undocumented immigrants from Venezuela or from Mexico, or it might be the perennial boogeyman of urban-dwelling Black people who are taking from the government, right?
This doesn't die. This myth doesn't die.
Yes, and in other countries, there's another, right?
Yeah.
So our story needs to be more compelling than that story.
Okay.
And the good news about our story is it's supported by the truth.
Okay.
Right?
So I have only 2 more questions.
Okay, great.
Tell the story. Well, actually, maybe you can tell the story through this question.
Yeah.
Every week on Future Hindsight, I ask my guests to share a civic spark, one small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. So what's a good way to turn the insights you've shared with us into action?
Sure. I think one way is by telling your story. The other way is by joining an organization, right? And there is a bigger story afoot. So tell your story inside of this story. I was born in 1979, which means I was born at the birth of neoliberalism. And basically that story is a story where elites, both in government and in industry, have taken the wheel and driven us from one crisis to another. One subprime mortgage crisis to a climate crisis to a racial justice crisis again and again and again. Every 4 years or every 2 years, election time, one set of elites argues that they should have the wheel versus another set of elites. In this election, the American people handed the wheel from one set of billionaires and political elites to another set of billionaires and political elites. What would it look like if we, everyday working people, people who know how to solve hard problems, people who know how to make ends meet, how to make $1 out of 15 cents, people who know how to struggle together across difference, what would happen if we joined together and took the wheel? That could only happen if you and you and you and you, instead of placing your gaze upwards towards the billionaires and the elites who have failed us, who have used their ability to write the rules to get their kids to go into the fancy colleges without having any merit-based reason to do so, who have gotten to the top of industry and have broken our economy. What if we stopped looking up to them and look towards one another? That is the essence of organization. And so when we join organizations, when we join labor unions and we join civic organizations and we join our own parties, like the Working Families Party, we then create the conditions where we can govern, where we could take the wheel, and we could decide for ourselves the direction of our country, our democracy, and our world.
Well said. Last question. Looking into the future, what makes you hopeful?
What makes me hopeful?
This is not a very hopeful time.
You know, this is a...
But also, I think it's a time of opportunity.
Yeah. As Gramsci said, this is a time of monsters. But what makes me hopeful, actually, is the fact that in a time like this, when there are so many changes, let me use the analogy. I'm going to use a high-price item analogy. So this might out me as a part of the decadent elite. So on the iPhone, right? You have a bunch of apps on the iPhone, and you want to change the apps, you want to move them around, you hold really close and then they start to wiggle, right?
Yes.
And then you kind of move them around.
Yes.
I believe that this is a moment where in society, all the little pieces of society are wiggling. This is a realignment moment.
Yes.
And so now we can kind of move them around. And the far right doesn't only get purchase of that agency to move things around. We do too.
Yes.
And so we could ask ourselves fundamental questions about how we want our politics to organize, whether or not we want to build independent third parties from the ground up like I'm doing, how we want our economy organized. So many things are in flux. So yeah, they're going to send a wrecking ball to a lot of the establishment. And we'll see how far they go and what wreckage actually ensues. The upside is their brand is chaos. They seek to and know how to destroy things. They are not builders. In the wreckage of some of these institutions that never really served us to begin with, what can we build together? When invariably Donald Trump and MAGA fail at governing, and many of the people who are not MAGA cultish sort of people are having buyer's remorse, what is the opportunity to build a bigger we with the people who stayed home, the people who voted for democracy, and some of the people who may have voted for Trump, but they simply wanted change. That's also up for grabs.
Yes.
There's so many things that are up for grabs. And in a moment when, you know, winning's better than losing.
Of course.
But one of the advantages of a loss is that you get to reconsider and kick the tires on all of your assumptions. And from that, very, very novel things could be born. Experiments could be born, new institutions, new leaders, new organizations, new strategies. So this is a time, I think, that will birth the new democracy movement that we have yet to see. And anybody listening can be at the ground floor of that. That is very exciting. And anybody that's interested in that, you have a partner in me and the Working Families Party.
Thank you. That is very hopeful. And I agree, this is a unique opportunity when things are wiggling and about to move and we can be in there on the ground. Thank you so much, Maurice, for joining me on Future Hindsight. It was really a pleasure to have you on the show.
It was good to be here.
Maurice Mitchell is the National Director of the Working Families Party. Remember, civic action doesn't have to be complicated. It's about small steps that spark progress, like sharing this episode with a friend. So let's recap this week's Civic Spark and fire up our collective power. We are more powerful together than we are individually. You are an empowered citizen, just like we always say, and you join us every week to build our civic action toolkits. But how much more can we all get done when we share our tools? Join the organization, build a coalition, go out to vote in a group. It matters. 2025 is here. Let's be the spark. Next week on Future Hindsight, we're joined by Didi Kuo. She's a center fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University and the author of The Great Retreat, How Political Parties Should Behave and Why They Don't, which comes out on February 3rd.
So in understanding, these twin crises, one of democracy on the one hand and one of sort of capitalism or economics on the other, we really need to understand what it is democracies are failing to do for their citizens. And that really lies in a failure of representation and of articulating those interests and translating them into meaningful policy. That is a problem of political parties.
That's next time on Future Hindsight. Now, don't forget to hit that follow button on your podcast app. It's right there. This way, our episodes will stay in your rotation every week. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, see clearly, act boldly, and spark the change you want to see. Oh, you're still here. I guess you just can't get enough of Future Hindsight. In that case, you should sign up for the newsletter. Just go to futurehindsight.com to sign up for free. Then, every week, we'll come to you. This episode was produced by Zack Travis and me.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.